Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vlad Tarabara. I'm professor at Michigan State University and director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at MSU, CERES for short. CERES is a regional studies center that emphasizes the need to establish international linkages and explore emerging challenges across Europe and Eurasia. My colleague, Matt Pauly, who is a co-member of CERES and associate professor of history at Michigan State, will be a co-host of this event. Welcome to the event. My great pleasure to welcome you to the webinar, Post-Conflict Assistance to Ukraine, What to Expect, by our distinguished guest, Susan Fritz. Susan is a former USAID Regional Mission Director to Ukraine and Belarus. After a 31-year career at the USAID, Susan retired as career minister in the senior foreign service. She served most of her career in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries, with a particular focus on the Balkans. At USAID, Susan's work focused on strengthening democracy and governance and mitigating conflict in countries that transition from authoritarian rule. Susan was introduced to us by Diandra Beck, former Associate Dean for Research at International Studies and Programs. Susan and Diandra are friends. We're very thankful to Diandra for giving us this opportunity to meet with Susan and now to learn from her. And thank you, Susan, very much for finding time and your willingness to share with us your knowledge. So this is a couple of words about the format. It's a 30 plus 30. We'll have 30 minutes for Susan's presentation, and then this will be followed by Q&A. If you have questions, please type them up in this chat Q&A window at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Again, a reminder that the webinar will be recorded. Again, welcome everyone, and Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vlad, and I really appreciate you inviting me here today to talk about how we might envision a program post-conflict in Ukraine. I'm going to use some PowerPoint slides to guide the discussion. So let me share my screen. Hopefully this will go without any issues. Let me start, hold on. That. No, hold on. Start the slideshow. There we go. Okay, can you see it okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So, so I'm basing my ideas, as Vlad said, I was the mission director in Ukraine from 2016 to 2020, and we had a special objective focused on countering Russian aggression. And so I will talk a lot about that program because that's really the basis of a lot of what I think we will need to do post this conflict in Ukraine. I also served in Bosnia in 1996 to 99, right after the war in the Balkans, and I managed our democracy building programs there. And so I thought bringing in some of that experience from that post-conflict program might be useful as well. So let me move to the next, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so let me start with the post-Maidan strategy and programming. This is the USAID 5-year strategy that we developed after the Maidan to guide our programming in Ukraine. So our overarching goal was an independent, democratic, prosperous, and healthy Ukraine united around core European values. And as you can see from this schematic, we had 4 development objectives. If you look to the right, 3 and 4 are what you would traditionally see in a development program. So strengthening democratic governance, inclusive, sustainable, market-driven economic growth. But the first 2 objectives, which were our priority objectives, are a little bit unusual for a development program. So the first one is corruption reduced in target sectors. And the second one, impacts of Russia's aggression mitigated. This was expected to be about a $200 million a year program. In the end, it was about 160 to 180 million a year. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper in development objective 2, which is the impacts of Russia's aggression mitigated. As I said, this is, I think, a lot of the programming that will be needed after the conflict will be related to this. So let's go deeper. So let's first look across the board. So the first one, IRs are intermediate results. These are the results we expect to achieve. So the first one is related to improving conditions for reintegration. If you look at Ukraine before this conflict, you had separatist controlled areas, what we call the non-government controlled areas in the east. And it's referred to as the Donbass by a lot of folks. And essentially it's part of two oblasts that were taken control of following the Revolution of Dignity in 2000 and late 13, early 14. IR was related to improving the conditions for reintegrating that region. So it involved things like local governance and more specifically looking at citizen service centers. So we did a lot of those, particularly in the east of Ukraine. We built or helped the government build one outside of Mariupol, closer to the line of contact. And the idea there was to show the separatists and people living in the east in the non-government controlled areas what a modern European state looked like. So if you had to come over the line of contact, and a lot of people were coming to get birth certificates, all kinds of government services, we wanted to show how you could get a corruption-free, fast services with a friendly face. And so that was the idea behind that. Second, well, I'm not going to go too deep in each of those, but essentially we did economic development programming to develop linkages between, so after the conflict started, the last conflict, a lot of the economic linkages, the business linkages were broken. Markets, Russian markets were closed, so we helped companies to develop new markets in other parts of Ukraine, as well as value chains to link into. And then lastly, in that area, we did a lot and continue to do a lot related to documenting human rights abuses. So with an ongoing conflict already, the Ukrainian Helsinki Commission and a loose network of NGOs began documenting in a systematized way human rights abuses, and they continue to do that throughout this war. Moving to the second IR, Energy Security Advanced, just to give you a little background. So Russia weaponized energy and its control of energy resources against Ukraine. So the information I have is from 2017, and I'm sure much better now, but in 2017, Russia was the primary supply source for Ukraine's coal, so 55%, nuclear fuel, 70%, nuclear fuel waste, 100%, and oil products, 40%. In terms of electricity, Ukraine was completely dependent on Russia for frequency control. And so what we were trying to do is to help Ukraine identify the investments it needed to make, particularly in its electricity grid, so that it could make those investments, improve the grid, to disconnect from Russia, and which it did, I believe, in last fall, or fairly recently before the conflict. And then it had to operate a year alone, and then it could then connect to the European grid. So that was an investment we were making. The U.S. Department of Energy was helping them to build the capacity for its own, to keep its own nuclear fuel waste. And there also was some work related to cyber. It's not energy specific, it's all infrastructure. We're building the capacity of Ukraine to protect its infrastructure, particularly in the cyber space. Moving to intermediate result 3, increase availability and consumption of quality information. So there was a very active Russian disinformation campaign against Ukraine while I was there, and I'm sure it continues today and will continue in the future. And so what we were trying to do is a couple of things. One is to provide the capacity for people to know what was false information, to check sources, media literacy, if you will, as well as providing resources and capacity for, particularly for local media outlets to report and report well, balanced information. In that realm, we helped, for example, to build out a studio for the local branch of the national broadcaster in the East. So that was the third area. The last is common civic values increasingly embraced. So this was trying to get at building a more inclusive identity, Ukrainian identity. So one that was not just vyshyvankas, the Ukrainian shirts. It was getting at trying to build a Ukrainian identity that allowed for more than just the Ukrainian language, so Russian-speaking populations, to try to build an identity that was basically defined as civically active people. And so, the idea was to break down barriers and ideas, misperceptions between people. So a lot of folks in the East had never traveled west in Ukraine and vice versa. So we helped NGOs from each part of the country visit the other part of the country and work together, particularly youth, to kind of break down those stereotypes and things like that. So this is basically the development objective around mitigating the impacts of Russian aggression. And as you'll see later, a lot of what I'm recommending will be focused on similar areas. So I'm going to move to the next slide. So now I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on post-conflict assistance to Bosnia. So again, the Dayton Peace Accords were signed at the end of '95. It was about a $200 million a year program. We opened our mission shortly thereafter, so early '96, and we had a three-pronged program. So the first and the most significant was repairing municipal infrastructure. So we helped to restart businesses and assist citizens to return to their normal lives by creating the conditions to do so. We were instrumental in reconstructing and repairing water systems, schools, health clinics, roads, power infrastructure. We had something like 1,600 projects in all across the country. And we also provided some small grants and loans to enable minority IDPs and refugees return to their homes. The second area was jumpstarting the economy. So we had a business loan development program, which basically helped private sector businesses to restart their operations and to provide jobs for citizens. So people, particularly the men who had been fighting, so that they could come back home and work and get back to a normal life. The reflows from that program funded a lot of different efforts, such as deposit insurance, public sector accounting, agricultural production, bank supervision, and all these things helped to stabilize the economy and restored public confidence in the banking system. So now I'm going to turn to the third area, which is the one I'm most familiar with because I managed it, and it's in the democracy and governance field. So the Dayton Peace Accords required elections 6 to 9 months after the peace agreement was signed. So by mid-June to mid-September, we had to have elections completed. And the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the OSCE, was designated to carry out those elections. But they had not done that before. They had monitored elections, but they had never administered them. So we got to about April and May of that year, and we knew they could not pull it off. So we embedded, USAID hired a team of about 6 to 8 election administration experts, and we embedded them into the OSCE to carry out the elections, which happened in September, so by the Dayton Peace Accord deadline. We also provided training, lots of training for poll workers, election poll workers, poll watchers, political party poll watchers, civic poll watchers as well. In addition, we helped support the establishment of Bosnia's first independent TV network. And then we did a lot related to governance, building local government capacity, and to stand up some new governance institutions that were part of a pre-Dayton, if you will, agreement that the US had forged between the Bosnian Croats and the Bosniaks. And it established some new government institutions, some cantons and local government. So we helped with that. So that's it on Bosnia. I don't want to spend too much time on that. we move to Ukraine, I'm going to start with some context because I think it's important to understand the context in which we're dealing, and particularly some of the issues that are likely to pop up, or the things that we need to look at and examine and think about as we develop a program and go into a post-conflict program in Ukraine. The first is a Supplemental Appropriations Act was recently passed. It provides for $13.6 billion in emergency funding to support Ukraine. Now, most of that is defense related, but about $4 billion is for the State Department, which $1.4 billion is for migration and refugee assistance, so humanitarian assistance, and $1.1 billion is for a specific account. It's the Assistance for Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia, or IECA, to respond to needs in Ukraine. And this is the account that USAID normally gets its resources from. So a good portion of these funds are likely to go to USAID to administer. Within the supplemental, there's also $2.8 billion for USAID specifically, but most of that is for humanitarian assistance. $2.65 billion is for disaster relief, and $120 million is for transition initiatives. That's transition initiatives, or OTI, it's referred to as, that's stabilization programming. And those are similar to the programs that I described as countering Russian aggression. A lot of that was done initially by OTI. And again, USAID spending up till now has been about 150 to 200 million a year. So we're talking about a huge increase. Now going to the Ukrainian context, there are two things that I think are really important. One is corruption, and the other one is pro-Russian elements of political life in Ukraine. The first one, so Ukraine had not sufficiently tackled corruption and the issue of corruption before February 24th. So any assistance program is going to have to build in mitigating any opportunities for corruption and factor that into the assistance design. I think a lot will depend on the role that you play during this current war in the defense of Ukraine, and whether there will be a quid pro quo after the war, as there was after the Maidan revolution, which made it very difficult to tackle corruption at that level after that revolution. There was a meeting, I read recently that there had been a meeting between the oligarchs and Zelensky, the president, on February 23rd, right before the conflict started. And at that meeting, the oligarchs declared their readiness to help with ranging from supporting the military, financing the military, to producing arms. And so, we'll have to follow that pretty closely. On the flip side, last September, the Zelensky government had passed a de-oligarchization law, which basically it was aimed at reducing the economic and, I would say, political power of Ukraine's richest people. So these are people like Kolomoisky, Akhmedov, Pinchuk, Poroshenko, and Zhivago. They were all included on this list. And the law specifically forbids designated oligarchs from funding political parties and participating in the privatization of state-owned enterprises. So I would say watch that space, watch what happens with the oligarchs and what role they play during the war, because that will certainly influence how much corruption can be tackled and reforms can be advanced. The second area, which I think, it's just a big question mark in my mind, and that's the pro-Russian elements in Ukrainian political life right now. So just to give you an idea, there are a number of political parties that are pro-Russian: Opposition Platform for Life, Our Land, Opposition Bloc, Nashi, and others. Opposition Platform for Life came in second in the last elections. It won 43 of 450 seats in the Verkhovna Rada, or the parliament, and that was in 2019. Just recently, in late March, Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council suspended 11 pro-Russian parties. I saw recently in the last couple of days that Viktor Medvedchuk, the leader of Za Zhitia, that For Life party, he was arrested. So I have a number of questions, including one is whether these parties will continue to exist, or will they change their policies? Another is how much support will these parties have after the conflict? After the Maidan, we saw a shift away from public opinion against Russia. And I believe that this conflict will further drive people away from Russia, and we'll have to see what happens with these political parties. But they have been a major drag on economic and other reforms in Ukraine. So if they're removed from the political process, then perhaps that will be positive for Ukraine. And then lastly, in terms of context, as I think alluded to, a major factor impacting the post-conflict landscape and assistance program will be the nature of the peace agreement. So as we saw in Bosnia, we had to have elections within 6 to 9 months. In the Ukraine context, will there be elections? What will be the provisions related to reintegration of the Donbass? If the Donbass remains part of Ukraine, will they have political representation in parliament? If so, how will that influence or impact the parliament's pro-reform and pro-European outlook? If there's elections, who can run and who can vote? Will the environment be sufficient for free and fair elections? What will be the timing? I think one thing we have learned over the last 30 years is that we used to push for elections early on in a post-conflict environment, and we learned that that's not always the best idea because the conditions might not be there for a free and fair election. So also watch that space. Let's see what the peace agreement says, and then that can drive a lot of the programming, particularly on the democracy side, but I think overall as well. So now I'm going to move to what elements of a post-conflict program might look like, particularly looking on the non-democracy side, so humanitarian and economic. Before I get into the programming itself, I should mention that an important piece, particularly when you see, the amounts of money that I talked about from the US, other donors will have equal amounts. I'm sure there will be some kind of pledging conference. There'll be a lot of money. So there needs to be a coordination mechanism between and among donors and with the Ukrainian government, and then within the US government as well. There already is one after the Maidan, when the US government started spending lots of money. There was a high-level assistance coordinator appointed. It was Ambassador Bond, a well-respected retired US ambassador. And subsequent to that, that position was filled by lower-level people. But I could see, bringing back a well-respected, highly regarded person to both coordinate internally within the US government, because there are a lot of different agencies and organizations providing assistance, but also to engage with other donors as well. So moving on from that to the assistance itself, I think it'll be really important if we want to get people back. We need to repair housing and to demine. I saw a recent interview with Mayor Klitschko. He indicated 80 apartment buildings in Kyiv were damaged, and as we've seen, countless homes. Airports in Kyiv and Lviv shelled. Mariupol has been decimated. So we'll need to assess the damage across the country, and donors will need to have access to that information in order to coordinate and not be tripping all over themselves. Like Bosnia, there will be a need for a small-scale infrastructure program, but on a massive scale, given the size of the country. So Bosnia, just to give you an idea, it had less than 4 million people in 1996 compared to Ukraine's 44 million. Land mass-wise, Ukraine is 12 times bigger than Bosnia was. And as I mentioned earlier, special attention will need to be paid to reducing opportunities for corruption in that kind of program. For large-scale infrastructure, I imagine the World Bank will likely take the lead on that. Energy will take on renewed importance. Ukraine will need to repair energy infrastructure and step up progress on connecting to the European grid that I described earlier. It needs to be able to store its own nuclear waste. Russian gas continues to flow to Europe through Ukraine, and Ukraine benefits, gets $2 billion a year to do so. And that's, as of a couple of days ago, is still flowing. So That's going to be a long-term issue and an immediate issue. What happens to Nord Stream 2, which would bypass the Ukrainian pipeline, is a question not only for Ukraine, but for the rest of Europe. How quickly can Europe wean itself from Russian gas, and how Ukraine can fill the financial hole left when it no longer gets $2 billion a year from Russia for gas transit are all open questions and important ones. Turning to agriculture, ag is about 12% of Ukraine's economy. However, if you consider the broader impact of the conflict on the world's food security, you'll understand the importance of Ukraine's agriculture. So last year, the UN World Food Program sourced more than half of its supplies from Ukraine to feed the hungry around the world. Ukraine is the EU's fourth biggest external provider of food, provides more than half of its corn imports, a fifth of its soft wheat imports, and a quarter of its vegetable oil imports. The EU imports half of Ukraine's production of sunflower oil. Other countries are also reliant on both Russian and Ukrainian grain, including Egypt, Lebanon, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and Turkey. And for example, about half of Algeria's wheat imports come from Ukraine alone. So restarting Ukraine's agricultural production will be important. However, I should caution that this will take time. Farmers can't plant now and during the conflict. We don't know how long the conflict will go on. We could lose not only this growing season, but next. And then what we're hearing is the Russians are planting mines. So those mines will need to be cleared before the farmers can plant. So that also will take time. So these are all important issues to restarting that sector of the economy. After the Maidan, the World Bank, IMF, and EU provided more than $38 billion to stabilize Ukraine's economy, which was in a free fall. The US provided three $1 billion sovereign loan guarantees through USAID as part of that effort. I couldn't figure out what the number was. It's either 14 billion or 22 billion remains of that debt. Whether it's 14 or 22, it's a lot of money remaining in that debt. So debt restructuring and more financing will be needed to stabilize Ukraine's economy. Again, both not just after the conflict, but now during the conflict. And this is something the IMF will take the lead on, and the World Bank as well. And I would imagine that the US provide more sovereign loan guarantees, but that will remain to be seen. On a micro level, similar to Bosnia, getting businesses restarted and people back to work will be really important. So grants, loans, technical assistance for private sector companies will be necessary. I could see the US finance. There's something called the WestNIS or Western NIS Enterprise Fund, which invests in Ukrainian companies and is active in Ukraine. I imagine WestNIS will play an important role as well. And I should highlight that there's $150 million in liquidated assets from TUSRIF, which is the US Russia Investment Fund, that have been sitting idle because there hasn't been an agreement between USAID and Congress on the use of those funds. I wouldn't be surprised if there is an agreement to use those for Ukraine, and that would likely go through the WestNIS Enterprise Fund to expend. So now I'm going to turn to what I call democracy and governance programming, and these elements of a post-conflict program. So starting off, elections and transitional justice, I think those will be determined by the terms of the peace agreement. Similarly, reintegration of the Donbass, economically governing institutions and the like. It'll be difficult for Western donors to work, particularly in what is now the non-government controlled areas of the Donbass. They're very anti-West. So I imagine maybe UN agencies might take the lead there. Next, treating trauma and war victims. This is something that USAID has been involved in since the last conflict started, both helping in terms of trauma and mental issues coming out of trauma, but also physical trauma and getting wheelchairs. We work through Johns Hopkins University on the mental issues side, and we work with the United Cerebral Palsy Association to help support getting wheelchairs and therapies and other equipment necessary to help people regain, as normal life as they can after they've been injured. Next, supporting local governments to restart services across the country. I mentioned citizen service centers, so reassessing, what needs to be repaired and what we can do to help local governments to restart services to citizens will be important. And then again, looking at that, our work related to countering Russian aggression and creating an inclusive Ukrainian identity, common civic values-based Ukrainian identity, I think will be really important. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There are nationalistic strands and tendencies in some parts of Ukraine. And so I don't know whether that will get worse with this war. You could understand that happening. So continuing to work on an inclusive and positive and civic values-based Ukrainian identity, I think will be important. And then moving to reforms and corruption. So continued work on combating corruption. As I said, the job was not done when this conflict started. And a lot of the reforms that had started after the Maidan, the early ones got through, but as time went on, a lot of those reforms waned. And so I could see renewed efforts on health systems reform, privatization, banking, energy, and customs, which were all areas that we were working on and trying to advance those reforms. Again, media literacy. This is something that USAID has been helping with for a long time, and I don't see Russia backing away from its disinformation campaigns that have been very actively trying to undermine the Zelensky and previous governments. I don't think that's going to go away, even if there's a peace agreement. The same thing with cybersecurity. I don't see Russia stopping at cyber attacks on Ukraine. So building that capacity within the Ukrainian government will be extremely important. And then lastly, civil society. Continued support of civil society in a variety of roles will be important. So reconciliation, service delivery, anti-corruption, continuing to advocate for reforms and push reforms and support reforms will all be, I think, important aspects of their role in a post-conflict Ukraine. So with that, that's all I wanted to present in terms of my ideas for a post-conflict program and considerations. I got 3 questions initially, so I thought I would start with those. Matt, is that okay? Vlad, can I move on to the questions and then we'll open it up for more questions?
Sure. Would you like to field them yourself? You're fine doing that?
I can do that, or however you guys want to do it. When I start with the questions and then
sure. You can react to what's there.
We'll go okay. On. Sounds good. So here are the questions. So the first one is the ongoing humanitarian disaster. What are its unique aspects from the point of view of post-conflict work that will be needed? So 2 things came to mind when I saw this question. One is the fact that so many people have been displaced. 6.5 million people inside the country, so IDPs, and over 4 million outside the country, so refugees. My sense, however, and it might be just anecdotal, but I saw something in the news today, so that suggests it wasn't just anecdotal, but people want to come home. So a lot of people I know who live in Kyiv have started to come back, but then what I saw today is the largest numbers crossing the border from Poland back into Ukraine since the conflict started in the last couple of days. So people want to come home. So getting the housing, demining, and services back and utilities back will be really important. The other thing I wanted to mention that was unique to me in my development career, and it's something I saw in Ukraine that I think we'll see more of. And that's that Ukraine's problems don't neatly fit into these different categories: humanitarian, stabilization, or long-term development. And why that's important is most donors' money, and the US is no different, comes in those categories. So you can only spend humanitarian money on humanitarian issues. And so there are legal and regulatory boundaries around what you could spend money on. And so I'll give you a good example that I think can illustrate this for you. And that is the Donetsk water filtration station, which is on the government controlled side in the east, but provides water for citizens on both sides of the line of contact. It was being shelled, threatening the whole time I was in Ukraine, threatening water supply to both sides, millions of people on both sides of the line of contact. So that's a humanitarian issue, right? But it also had not been well maintained. And so between that and the fact that on the people on the non-government controlled side were not paying for the water, those aren't humanitarian issues. So the humanitarians are saying, well, we can spend money on this because these are not humanitarian issues. And then as we started to dig a little deeper, we realized that plant was overbuilt for the number of people it was serving. So it was very expensive to run. So it needed to be either rebuilt smaller or modified in some way. That's a long-term development issue. So, you know, we had to bring together everybody, the humanitarians, the development water experts, and diplomats to bring some diplomatic firepower behind, you know, trying to get the other side to pay to address all three problems. And I suspect we're going to run into similar issues to that as we start to rebuild Ukraine. And so bridging funding sources, combining humanitarian, stabilization, and development experts, getting them together with diplomats to bring that diplomatic firepower to address some of these issues will be important. So with that, I'll move to the second question. Okay, or did Matt or Vlad, do you want to any follow up on that, or should I move?
No, I mean, I'm fine reading them to you, or if you're okay handling them yourself, go for it, I guess.
Okay, well, I'll move to the second question, and then we can do the ones I have on the board, and then we can move to open questions, okay?
Very good.
Okay, so how may the legacy of corruption in Ukraine impact plans for reconstruction? As I've said a couple times, that we have to design programs to mitigate the opportunities for corruption. What that means in reality is, what I've seen is we would contract or grant funds to US organizations to oversee the construction, and then they would subcontract that out to local companies. This is a good way to ensure proper oversight of the construction. I saw this in Kosovo, where we had a program to refurbish schools, and the government of Kosovo had its own program. Our construction was so much better. They were using the same companies, the same local companies, but they couldn't keep as good an eye on the actual implementation of the construction. We'll also have to vet local construction companies to ensure they're not tied to corrupt actors or oligarchs. Another thing that we did in Bosnia was we had a concurrent audit of our municipal infrastructure program by the USAID Inspector General at the same time we were implementing the program. So that way we caught issues right away. Usually the IG will come in 3, 4, or 5 years later and tell you should have done X, Y, or Z better. Well, by having it, you know, side by side, we had somebody looking over our shoulders every step of the way, and therefore we could catch things earlier in the implementation process and fix them. The Ukraine supplemental that I described, that includes $4 million each to the USAID and State Department Inspectors General. So I suspect we'll see, we could see some kind of operation like that, where you have a concurrent audit to oversee construction or whatever aid ends up doing, and state and other agencies. And then lastly, I think on a more positive note, we may have greater opportunities and renewed commitment to tackle corruption, because there have been, people have fought so hard and for their country, and so they don't want to come back to a country that still has corruption. They want to see the country move forward. So hopefully that will be true, and I have a lot of faith in those who have fought so hard all along for fighting corrupt issues and advancing. I think they we'll have a renewed firepower to do that. And then lastly, what, if anything, can be done now as the war is unfolding for the US and other Ukraine's allies to be in the best position for post-conflict rebuilding and humanitarian assistance? So I think the first thing would be, I think we need good information on what the damaged infrastructure and housing and all the things that need to be repaired, that there needs to be some kind of central system for cataloging that, or a database of some sort that would be available to everybody. So I think that can start now, as the Russians leave communities, that assessment can be taking place so that when the time is right, when there's peace, we can move in quickly and we'll know what the needs are. And that's another way to ensure that donors aren't stepping all over themselves and trying to do the same thing. There might be a division of labor between donors and the government, perhaps geographically or by type of infrastructure. Maybe one donor will take, certain oblasts and another donor could take other oblasts. And then, as I mentioned earlier, fostering collaboration across the assistance spectrum, from the humanitarians to the long-term development experts, would ensure seamless programming and in a way that we ensure that the humanitarians are providing assistance so that in a way that doesn't undermine long-term development, and that long-term development experts and medium-term development experts are learning from the experience and knowledge of the humanitarians who get in there early on in the post-conflict situation. So that's it. That's all my presentation, and I will stop sharing my screen and open it up for additional questions.
Right. So thank you so much. Very comprehensive. I am just, I'm very grateful for your presentation and all the areas that you covered. I thought I had an understanding of the complexity of this problem, and you educated me anew. So I'm very grateful for all that you shared. I'm reacting to the questions that appeared in the Q&A portion of the webinar, and I'll sort of summarize maybe some of them for you and have you react. So my first question in my brain was most certainly, what can we do now? I think that's foremost on the minds of most Ukrainians, and any Ukrainian that might be tuning in to this webinar from Ukraine probably thinks at some level this is a very healthy and good discussion. On the other hand, it's perhaps a bit premature given what they're facing. So I'm very glad to have you already respond to that. So let's move on perhaps to one question, which is about your experience with IDPSs, that is internally displaced persons, and the time it takes to engage in stabilization and long-term development, building trust, and starting in particular with women. I think this question about the role of women in particular is quite important. Maybe you might also reflect on the sort of gender imbalance that is now taking place in Ukraine, right? When women and children have fled the country, men are remaining in Ukraine to fight the war, although women are certainly engaged in combat and certainly still present in Ukraine. But you have a large population of largely women and children that will be returning. So maybe we might begin there.
Okay, so one thing to remember and truly amazed me in the last conflict, right after the Maidan, there were a lot of IDPs then as well. And what amazed me about Ukraine was that so many people took in others. And so, the humanitarian effort that went on, not like unorganized, not like just an NGO doing something, people-to-people assistance was phenomenal. And so this is a much larger scale, so we'll just have to see. But the Ukrainian people have an unending ability to provide help to their fellow man and woman. And So I suspect you'll continue to see that, but the displacement has been so large that it, are there enough people that are in a position to help? Are they going to be able to help? And I think that'll be the limiting factor. But it was an amazing thing to see post Maidan and with the Donbass conflict, and so I think we'll continue to see that. In terms of stabilization, and the time it takes, I think that's a harder question. I think the more we can get people back to their homes, the more we can get people back to work, at jobs, making a living, and back to normalcy, obviously that stabilizes things pretty quickly. So, a large question in my mind is what is the extent of the damage, and how quickly are we going to be able to get people back to normal lives? I can't tell you that. I don't know. It's a lot. The other aspect is the stabilization of the economy, and that that's another thing. Just trying to figure out how much is that going to cost, and who's going to pay, and how, can the IMF come up with the amount of money they're going to need to help stabilize now and then after the conflict. So those are our two dimensions that I think we need to take a look at. But beyond that, in terms of our own programming, I have to say, I found our work in the East, we worked in the government controlled areas. So on this side of the line of contact, in all the 4 or 5 oblasts, from north to south. And we had great partners to work with. We were able to do a lot in our stabilization programming. And that is what we based that whole development objective on, where we expanded those efforts. I forget the amount of money. I think it was like $15 to $20 million a year in stabilization programming. We expanded that to tens of millions of dollars, because there was the absorptive capacity and good partners to work with, and the will of the people with whom we were working. So I think there's capacity there and interest, but we'll have to see who we're working with, who are we stabilizing. Is it the whole country? That could take a lot longer. And what position are people in to engage in those kinds of efforts?
Yeah, and I guess I should be quite transparent. So I guess we were asking both about internally displaced people, but also people returning from abroad. And that was the, I suppose, impulse of my question about the place of women in particular, the way in which, a population that has been pushed outside the country, that has been separated from their family, is going to be reintegrated into Ukrainian society. And I suppose that dovetails with the concern I have about sort of the militarization of Ukrainian society that you must have inevitably confronted in Bosnia as well, right? So this is a society in which weapons are in the hands of many, and as I said, there's this sort of gender imbalance that is going to shift when families reunite, but it's going to be, I would suspect, a psychologically traumatic process as well. So I don't know if you want to, you can take that question in any way, but there's a particular concern, and I've seen it not only in the Q&A here about empowering women in particular to be fundamentally central to this process of returning to something resembling normal civil society.
Yeah, I guess I would mention two things. One is, if you look at what happened to Ukraine after the last conflict, during and after the last conflict. So you had pretty weak, and you had these battalions, the Azov Battalion and others, that fought, and they were kind of on their own. And the work that Ukraine has done from 2014 till now to basically bring them into the formal military system, I think is positive, because then you have with norms and everything that go with a state military. That's, you know, not just a bunch of bands of groups of you know, fighters. So that's one aspect. You know, on the gender issue, I think also, to add to what you said, I think a lot depends on what are they coming back to. You know, a lot of people are being killed in this war. And so are they coming back to a militarized society? That's one dimension. But then are they coming back to a family, like they don't have a husband, there's, you know, or they don't have a spouse, and then they've got to raise kids on their own. I mean, that, you know, that's going to be a challenge as well. So there's a lot of dimensions to that I, you know, I haven't thought much about, but I think you're right. It's really important to start thinking through those issues, because it'll be important.
Absolutely correct. Yeah. I mean, there's going to be significant loss, and the donor community will have to confront that as well, right? Grief, but also loss of labor, and the real psychological problem of refashioning society and stabilizing families. There's several questions about timeline that requires a crystal ball, and I think you've spoken on that aspect. Many people who've gathered with us for this webinar are academics, and so they're eager to know what academics can do, particularly ones who are who've done research in the area, have linguistic skills to offer. So is there anything that you might be able to recommend there? And then I suppose more on an institutional level, what universities can do to play a partnership role with the U.S. government and with the donor community as well to help Ukraine.
Yeah, you know, I don't have any, first of all, on the timeline, yes, you're absolutely right. I don't have any crystal balls. On what people can do to help, you know, that's a hard one. You know, I know there are lots of efforts, fundraising efforts going on in my community. I'm here in Washington, D.C., and elsewhere. I just came actually from New Jersey. I saw some efforts up there as well. So I would say continuing to support any efforts in your own communities, and starting your own efforts to help raise funds to support a variety of NGOs, World Central Kitchen. There's a lot of good organizations doing great work to help refugees and IDPs. And that's not an academic issue, that's a human issue. You know, it's anybody can do anything to help, whether you volunteer your time or initiate some efforts or provide funding. You know, it's hard. You know, both my kids went to school, high school in Ukraine. And so they're both in university now. So they're grappling with like what they can do to help. And I have one of my kids is out in England and another one in New York. And so my daughter's protesting whenever she's the one in New York, anytime there's an opportunity to protest, that's how she engages. And she's been collecting goods to help donate, to help somebody who's collecting goods to send over to Ukraine. So that's how she's engaging. My son went to Poland on spring break and went to the border and volunteered his time. There are lots of opportunities to do that. Not everybody can do that, but I would say, you know, find your niche in terms of academics. If you have relationships with universities in Ukraine, reach out to them, ask them, how can I help you? I think that's the best way to see what you can do to help. Because we can guess from here, but I reached out to my former secretary and asked her, what do you need? And she doesn't need anybody, she needs somebody to talk to. So find out by asking your colleagues that you work with in the various universities, what you can do to help. And then if you're thinking about the future, of the things that I talked about, think about what expertise you have to bring to the reconstruction efforts. Do you have engineers? Do you have, as you mentioned, language skills? How do you think you can contribute? And then start planning with your colleagues in those universities in Ukraine towards the reconstruction efforts. It may be hardcore, like rebuilding, or it could be on the soft side. Start thinking about education. I haven't even scratched the surface on universities. What's happening with the universities right now? What's happening with college kids in Ukraine? How are they going to get those classes up and running again? Or maybe they continue to have them. Maybe there are ways of helping them continue operations virtually. Maybe there are ways that your university or others can engage to support them now during the conflict. I think the first thing is to reach out and ask, what do they need?
Very good. Do you have time for one more question? I think we were trying to keep it to an hour, but it's an important one, I think, which is about Ukrainian voices. We tend to look at this, I think, obviously from the perspective of the donor community and the US government. After all, it's the US taxpayer that's funding any such effort. But I know from my own experience, having worked with the embassy long ago, that USAID absolutely is involved with Ukrainian communities, Ukrainian NGOs. And so there's, unlike Bosnia, I would suggest, of course, that there's a considerable history to draw from, and you've already talked about that specifically for the years following the Maidan. So that's heartening to hear that there's already a record of really addressing some of these concerns. But we have a question from a graduate student in the history program, John Shetachka, who has been involved with helping Ukrainian aid groups in specific. So he asked, can you talk more about the collaboration with Ukrainian groups that might take place after the war? That is, how do groups like USAID and others work with local actors to facilitate best outcomes?
So absolutely, we, as you mentioned, Matt, we engage with local counterparts, whether it's in the government, obviously any kind of reconstruction, rebuilding, prioritization, we'll have to engage with our colleagues in the Ukrainian government at the national, regional, and local levels. That's not always easy because they don't always agree. For example, I remember going out east and meeting with the governor of one of the oblasts, suggested that somebody from the central government come out and join us. There was not a lot of coordination happening, so we were trying to get the different levels of government coordinating. So there are different levels that we have to engage with and ensure that we're responding to their needs, and sometimes we have to also help the government itself to coordinate, because that doesn't always happen, particularly in a country the size of Ukraine. So that'll be one part. In terms of NGOs, USAID has a long history of working with many NGOs, not only Kyiv-centric ones. There are some national well-known organizations that we've worked with, but also right before I left, we had started engaging more at the regional and local levels to build that capacity outside of Kyiv. And so as a result, the civil society and NGOs more specifically across the country are stronger and much stronger now than they were 5 or 10 years ago. But that's one of the impressive parts and of Ukraine, or aspects of Ukraine, and why I mentioned in my presentation that donor supportive NGOs will be really important, and it's for a variety of roles, whether it's reconstruction or advocating or helping with reforms. They could be providing services. There are many roles that civil society can play, and USAID, I'm sure. I mean, I don't work for USAID anymore, but just knowing civil society in Ukraine, they are impressive and will be, I am sure, at the forefront of all of these efforts that will need to take place, whether it's reforms or services or rebuilding. Civil society will be there and play an important role. So therefore, I'm sure aid will support them.
Yeah, just as a final, I suppose, editorial remark, I would hope and I would expect USAID is really reacting to Ukrainian demands and the Ukrainian script as well as about how rebuilding should look, what sort of program that will be. You spoke earlier about a notion of a civic identity in Ukraine. In many ways, that's already being done by the Ukrainians themselves. The US government, in fact, doesn't create Ukrainian identity. Ukrainians themselves create their own identity, and the US government helps foster a pluralistic form of democracy in many respects. Just this pure, where we sort of began with a discussion of internally displaced persons, the way in which Western Ukrainians are helping Eastern Ukrainians find sanctuary in Western Ukraine. That's a fascinating story, and I imagine Ukrainians from across the country will be involved in rebuilding different parts of the country. That is, it won't just be about locals rebuilding their own communities, although that will be a part of it, but also about Ukrainians traveling indeed to help parts of the country that have been particularly devastated. And of course, we can't say where all this will end. So I'm very grateful for you and for all your expertise and all the wisdom that you've offered to us to at least begin the discussion now. So those of you who remain, please, I know this is a webinar and it's hard to dedicate a particular moment for applause in the confines of the webinar, but I will clap for all of you, and maybe Vlad would like to add some concluding remarks and thanks as well.
Thanks, Matt.
Well, I just I'd like to echo Matt's remarks, and thanks, Susan, once again for your insights, for your very realistic and practical, practice-based perspective, and for maybe giving us a bit of hope. Everybody's asking, how can we help? And I think your knowledge is helping us understand what we can do is indispensable. Thank you very much, Susan, on behalf of all of us, I'm sure, in the audience.
Thank you. It was great being here today. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. We are concluding our webinar. Bye-bye.